to the second of the British Sociological Association Families and Relationships Study Group series of webinars around decolonising families and relationships studies. So this is a series of online events that the study group have put on this year. And as I said, this is the second of 3. So you can see that the next one coming up is on Friday the 18th of June, and more details about that one and that the running order will be on our web pages shortly. But I'm really pleased to be chairing this event today. My name's Charlotte Faircloth, and along with Catherine Twomley and Alison Lamont and Julie Walsh, we are the conveners for the Families and Relationships Study Group this year. This was an initiative actually set up by the other conveners sort of recently, and I think it's a really sort of timely and important one, and you know, one that I'm really pleased to be part of, feeding into obviously not only our work as researchers but also as teachers, and I know that there are lots of colleagues in the group who have been thinking about initiatives like at UCL we call it kind of liberating the curriculum or decolonising the curriculum, and that's certainly something that is really critical to studies of families and relationships. So today we've got 3 speakers. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce you to them. The first is Dr. Natalia Concha, and she's a research fellow at the London School of Economics. And she's going to be presenting her paper here. Actually, no, sorry, you don't have the title there. Let me just pull it up. Called Decentering Maternal Trajectories, a study of intergenerational triads under adversity in Colombia. Our next presenter will be Sherilyn Deen, and she's a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology at the University of Amsterdam. So obviously one of the really nice things about these online events is that we're able to have international speakers joining us. And her presentation is called Mixing and Racialization, the Production of Knowledge and Mixed Marriages and Relationships in the Netherlands. And then finally, we're really delighted to be able to include a presentation from Briony Campbell, who's a filmmaker and photographer, and her project is called Love in Translation, a sort of photography and film-based project which tells the stories of African British families living in African countries. So the format for today, and I should just remind you all that this is being recorded in case you've got sort of colleagues who'd like to catch up on it later, and just to sort of warn you that your participation in the chat might be part of that, will be that we'll have the 3 speakers presenting kind of in turn. So unless there are any sort of minor questions that you've got for them in between their presentations, then please sort of keep your larger questions, as it were, for the discussion period at the end. Unfortunately, that will have to be sort of through the chat function because of the way that this meeting has been set up, and because, as you heard at the beginning, we're quite a large group of people. So please do feel free to use the chat function. I'll keep an eye on that and sort of, along with the other conveners, you know, put those questions to the panelists. But if there's something you do really want to say, that's completely fine, and we've got the option of, I think, you know, inviting you to be a panelist or asking you to talk. So do just feel free to say, I'd like to ask a question as well, if you'd find that easier. I was saying earlier, again, I find the sort of having to put things down in chat sometimes feels more arduous than just being able to ramble a little bit. Anyway, so without further ado, we're going to kick off with Natalia, who will hopefully well, maybe actually if we just leave the holding slide up, because I don't think you've got slides, have you? Anyway, not to worry. Natalia, if you want to take it away, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today and extend my thanks to the BSA group for organizing this space. And yeah, very excited to talk about this important topic with you all. So as Charlotte said, I don't have slides, but the title of my talk is looking at decentering maternal trajectories. And this is based on a study that I did in Colombia about intergenerational triads that live under adversity. So even though I don't have slides, I do want to talk to you about 2 things. First is use my qualitative case study to apply this notion of decentering. And that is to uplift the other ways in which maternal trajectories are experienced. And in this case, as I said, they happen in intergenerational triads. And that is the bit where I tie in the family component for the seminar. And then for the second part of the talk, I want to situate North-South-North dynamics that are informed by decolonial feminist thinking. And I tie in with the research where I apply this idea of positioning subjectivities in context, because context very much matters. So the first thing is to introduce you to the community where I worked and did the research. I've been connected to the community throughout the years in many different projects. And it is known as the district of Agua Blanca, which is part of the urban periphery of Cali, Colombia, the city where I'm from. Cali is Colombia's third largest city, and it is located close to the Pacific coast. So as a result, it has received migratory waves of people that were displaced by the internal armed conflict, which unfortunately has been battering the country for more than 6 decades. Now, although I do draw from my PhD, much of the contextual understanding that I brings from that long-term engagement with the community. And I think that's an important point that we have to remember when we're applying non-individualistic approaches in research. And in the district, which is how it's known locally, we see how it is an area that embodies the contradictions and the multifaceted dimensions of the Latin American periphery in many ways. So we have on the one hand, the headlines that everyone hears, which is the narco-traffic, the micro-traffic that operates in the neighborhoods, which are known as barrios, the poverty, the gender, and the structural inequalities. But then on the other, we have, that is what is more submerged, which is a rich culture that embraces art, music, different rhythms, dancing, a space of conviviality, of solidarity, of community, and of family life. And part of what the colonial feminism tells us is to de-essentialize. And that's the decentering that I apply, where it is, of course, important to recognize the problems, where they come from, with the histories of oppression and inequalities that produce them, but also the richness of the life world, of the sociocultural resources, and of the many social realities that people who live in these spaces share across. So to give you a snapshot of the research, I adopted a qualitative longitudinal design to enable capturing maternal transitions. That was the main aim of the research. And for that purpose, I interviewed pregnant women who were going to be first-time biological mothers. And I also interviewed some of their mothers who are known as mamitas. Mamitas in these areas are not, they are grandmothers, but they don't want to be called grandmothers. Many of them were my age. They were in their 30s and 40s. And so the idea of being regarded as a white-haired woman who's knitting is not something that they adhere to. So I talked to, first, at the start of the fieldwork, to 35 pregnant women and to 15 mamitas. And then I followed them, most of them, for a year. And then I also talked to 17 community leaders and people that worked in the hospital and the health institution and in maternal projects in the area. So that gives you a sort of idea of the research. Now, in terms of conceptualizations, my work problematizes representations of motherhood, espousing a one world sanitized view, which is dominant in Colombia and still largely in Latin America, through the imposition of the Catholic Church. And this has been epitomized in the Virgin Madonna. And Florence Thomas identified these in the 1990s in Colombia. Now, the representation of the Virgin has been tailored into many shapes, depending on the countries, on the region, and on the syncretism that took place across. And the most famous, the one that you might have heard of, would be the Nahuatl goddess, Tonatzin, who then became the Virgen de Guadalupe in Mexico. And Guadalupe has become quite popular in films and might be the one reference that will be familiar to those of you that are not from Latin America. But following Thomas, when we apply a critical feminist perspective, this becomes problematic on two fronts. First, we split the mother into a binary, where she's either the Madonna or the whore, with very little space in between, as Stella Weldon so poignantly identified. And as a result, this fails to acknowledge the difference and the intersecting inequalities of what it means to mother in the global South. And that is also something that Patricia Hill Collins from the 90s as well problematized about this social construction and how it ignores the embedded structural, macro level, unequal power dimensions played out between normativity and difference. And so this problem of sitting at the center of normativity with the nuclear heterosexual family has been a very powerful representation that permeates all the trajectories that do not fit this ideal. And that is something that was present in the model that I spoke to. And I'm going to give you an example of how that was played out, where they felt that they had to defend their position, their experience from this imposition. So they would tell me, the father of the baby is no longer with me, but he is going to bestow my baby his surname. I found that there was a lot of fathering absence in the community, and that reflects the local demographics, where more than half of the households are headed by women. And this would be the mamitas in my research. So the idea of bestowing legitimacy through the surname is something that they want to point out, because in Latin America, we use generally two surnames, and that acknowledges the maternal surname, but at the same time, the absence of one parent becomes very visible if you only have one. So this is something that they all talked about. And I think, again, this is where we see how patriarchy is embedded everywhere, in not just the representations, but also in the practices. And this, again, relates to the problem that it's not just about this ideal representation, but that mothers have been largely regarded as instruments for the development of the child. So this is where I also talk about decentering, where we're not just talking about the child in the center, but then we need to expand also into looking at the mother and to the other relationships of care. Because if we shift the position and regard mothers as psychological subjects in their own right, then again, we move them into a space closer to reality. So the experience that I found tells of something very complex, where there are challenges, there are barriers, there is stigma, but there are also a lot of support structures and resources and positive attitudes and resistance against these barriers that are important to conceptualize. And in that regard, I came up with a model of pushing and pulling forces in the maternal trajectory, where depending on how these are played out, they enable the mother to symbolically engage with the maternal experience. And in that regard, that's where the intergenerational component comes in, because I found that the mamitas were a central source of support. Once they reassured their daughters that they were able to count on them, then the engagement with this transition becomes evident. And then also for some of the pregnant women, even at the level of pregnancy, the baby starts becoming the object of their transformation. And this points out the other issue that we have in terms of stigma, which is that, I should say that most of them were between 16 and 20 years old. And we need to move away from this idea that young motherhood is always regarded as a calamity. Because for these women, it became a life project, the possibility to disrupt risky practices, staying away from drugs or from youth violent groups, or to reconsider the possibility of going back to school and engaging then in something more. When you become a subject to another, then that opens up also a horizon of possibilities. And so the second point I want to emphasize with the decentering is that the mamitas were a vital source of care and strength for both, not just in terms of helping with the baby once, you know, the babies were born, but also for their daughters, for their mothers. And so I argue that we also need to consider mothers and the support that they require. Again, is not just about the child. So one thing that was very interesting was how they shared mothering in the family dynamics. The women that were going to be first-time biological mothers then told me, well, I'm not really a first-time mother anymore because I've already been the mamita for my own siblings or for other members of the family or the community. And so they share that mamita positioning with their mothers. Then the mothers share the mothering positioning with the, you know, their daughters' children. And so there's that elasticity of positionings where we find the myriad of ways in which people do mothering across the world. So just to leave you with a few points about the research is to continue how we need to really continue challenging this calamity and this stigmatization that comes from when we're not adhering to the ideal. And in the research, it was played out in terms of singleness and in terms of youth. How then consider this extension from the child maternal diet to consider the other ways. In this case, it was the intersubjective triad with the mamitas, but how there are many ways in which mothering is reproduced across the generations and across family dynamics. So how am I doing for time?
Good, you've got a couple more minutes if you want them, but otherwise, yeah, maybe wrap up fairly soon. That's okay.
So in the time that I have left, then let me talk about the second part, which is the decentering in north-south-north dynamics, because there is north in the south and there is south in the north, and I think we need to remember also that. So just to quickly illustrate a journey that a local psychologist went through, who's called Maria Cristina Tenorio. Tenorio describes how she came from Colombia, then was schooled in the north in France, and then came back to work with Pacific Coast communities. And then she realized that the theories that she had learned in the north did not fit the life worlds that she was encountering. And so she started exploring other platforms with local anthropologists, with sociologists, with feminists, with people that had worked closely with the communities to be able to make sense of her findings. And then she returns to the north in a chapter produced in a cultural anthology book, where she situates the difference that Patricia Hill Collins has been telling us about. So I do think it's important to make other experiences more visible through engaging much more in that north-south-north connection. But Uchi Curiel, who is a decolonial feminist in Latin America, reminds us that we need to go beyond uplifting these articulations of difference. Because for decolonial feminists, this is also about extending into praxis and into activism. And another point that Ochi makes is that decolonial feminism did not come just from the academy. It was produced and practiced in communities, in social movements, from the street, from the territories. And then it was coined and packaged for academic audiences. So in Latin America, we've been doing decoloniality and decolonial feminism for a long time. I mean, it wasn't called that back then until, like, especially for decolonial feminism with Maria Logones, who is our decolonial feminist conceptual mother. But the point is that there is a common message about uplifting the power of experience of communities to conceptualize, which is something that also Hill Collins reminded us. And that relates to the need to decenter this hierarchy of knowledge systems, where academia and science is at the top, but we really need to recognize all the other forms of knowledge that exist in the world. And decolonial feminism in Latin America is about recuperating, recognizing the margins in the region, retelling the narratives of our colonial history, specifically in terms of, you know, continuing on to questioning the homogenizing that we saw in feminism in the first waves, you know, in relation to white privilege, but also the sexism that we also have seen in Afro and indigenous movements that have been dominated by men, and even in strands in the decolonial movement itself. So again, this is where decentering also applies, where we can and should acknowledge the barriers and the difficulties that we see within the movements and within our fields. And that's what Ochi calls desenganchar, to disengage, to dismantle that colonial syndrome, the binary representations, to not just do north, south, north, but also to situate the South in its rightful place globally, and to continue challenging, patriarchy, and in terms of thought and representations from that, Cartesian tradition that we're still suffering from. So just to end, just to everyone to be aware that theory is produced in other spaces, not just in like the solitary thinker de cogito. And that for decolonial feminism, critique and action and what we do as researchers is always a political act. And yeah, so that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and what a kind of perfect presentation to kick off the the webinar with. I mean, it really speaks exactly to the kind of themes that we were thinking about when we put together this, the call for papers for this series. And just, I don't know, I'm conscious I'm not going to talk to you about it too much right now, but this idea of decentering, both kind of theoretically, but also substantively in terms of even thinking about care and mothering, beyond the mother-child dyad, that just really spoke to me. So thank you so much. That was wonderful. If anyone's got any comments they'd like to ask quickly in the chat, then feel free. Otherwise, I think we will move on. Here we are, thank you. Move on to Sherilyn, who has got some slides, and so she's going to share those now. Thank you.
Yes, I will just put up the, let's see, so you are able to see my slideshow now, right? Great, okay, perfect. Let me just see if I can pull up my notes here. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy that I was invited to share some of my work here. My name is Sherilyn. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Amsterdam. And in my project, I focus on how the notion of mixing, and in particular mixed marriage and partnerships, are mobilized and politicized in the Netherlands. So to be more specific, I look into the ways in which discourses on mixing tie in with process of racialization, and particularly the systematic problematization of Muslims in the Dutch context. So that's my research project. And for this presentation, I would like to present to you part of my research that analyzes contemporary social scientific knowledge production on mixed marriage in the Netherlands, and I limit myself to focus on policy-oriented research produced by large government-funded social research institutes. So what I would like to do is first show you some of the material that I analyzed that I'm now working with. And then I will try to situate that also for you, to give it a bit more context. And finally, I would like to present some preliminary conclusions and arguments. I do have to say I'm currently in my second year of the PhD, so I haven't really published anything yet. I'm still in the midst of doing empirical work during a pandemic, so it's all very preliminary. So it would be really helpful, to hear your thoughts and feedback. So, since the beginning of the 2000s, we see a growing social, scientific, and statistical interest in mixed marriage in the Netherlands. And mixed marriage is then defined as unions between autochtonen and allochtonen, so autochtones and allochtones. And we see that this interest has specifically grown in the arena of integration research. So there are a few large research institutes, such as the Centraal Bureau voor de Statistiek, the CBS, and the Sociaal Cultureel Planbureau, the SCP, that produce integration reports every other year. And we see that mixed marriage has come to feature as a recurrent topic in those reports. Now this, I understand, immediately requires a little bit contextualization and explanation on the terminology. So in the Netherlands, the categorization autochtone, allochtone plays an important role in discourse, in the discourse on multiculturalism in general. So it's terminology that has been widely employed in politics by policymakers and in the media in order to talk and make sense of ethno-racial difference without really having to resort to explicit racial language. So strictly speaking, an autochtone is someone who was born in the Netherlands and has two parents that were also born in the Netherlands. And then allochtone refers to anyone who was born outside of the Netherlands or has at least one parent who was born outside of the Netherlands. However, important to note here is that this notion of allochtone is usually assumed to mean and coupled with non-Western. And it's also very often used to refer to the sort of like four biggest or classic migrant groups in the Netherlands. That is people with a Surinamese, Antillean, Moroccan, or Turkish background. And increasingly, it's also used for other migrants and also refugees from countries that are considered non-Western. But as you will also see in these integration reports, it's usually those large four groups that are at the focus of those reports. So this means that there's no formal registration of race or ethnicity in population statistics in the Netherlands, but there is registration of birthplace and birthplace of every resident's parents in municipal registers. So that makes it possible for statistical bureaus, such as the CBS that I just mentioned, to have access to registration data that enables them to distinguish between populations. And so I understand this through the work of Stuart Hall, who understands race as a floating signifier. And by using his work, I think we can say that this categorization produces a racialized distinction between a white native majority population on the one hand, and non-white minority populations that are rendered foreign and non-Western on the other. And one side note, even though these terms are, since a few years, they're no longer formally used because of their stigmatizing effects, we see that the replacement categories, which is migration background, non-migration background, are operationalized in the same way. So it's still about sorting the population into distinct ethnic groups for the purpose of policy making and research on levels of integration. So the process actually continues. Now, having giving that context, going back to the report on mixed marriage and integration, we can see that in the majority, the vast majority of these reports, the interest lies with either marriages within the own group of origin or marriages with an autochtone. So these are the only unions that are considered relevant, and any marriages that do not fall within these categories are not considered or considered other. So I have a few examples to maybe make it a bit more clear. So here's a table from the jaarrapport Integratie 2005 by the SAP, and we see that this says origins of the marital partners of allochtonen who were married in 2001, sorted by ethnic group and sex. So you see the four biggest groups that are the target of the research. As I mentioned, here it's sorted by sex, and here it says a marriage with an autochtone. These two categories refer to marriage within with someone with the same origin, but these are non-migration marriages, and these are migration marriages. So there's also a distinction there, and this is other. Then there's another example from 2007. This one sorts also by generation, in which it says own group, autochtone, and other. And then this is a bit more recent. This is actually quite recent. This is from 2020. Here we see again partner with a Dutch background, same origins from the Netherlands, same origins, migration, marriage, and other. So this one is very similar to this one actually. Now, Mixed marriage and integration in the reports are taken to be self-evidently coupled. So the conclusions are that the higher the frequency of mixed marriage within a group, the higher levels of integration of that group. And what I'm trying to do in my work now is trying to make sense of that articulation or that conjoining of mixing and integration. And I think in order to do so, we also need to understand the contemporary integration paradigm in the Netherlands and how mixed marriage as a topic of interest fits into that. So there's two bodies of work that I would like to discuss a little bit. The first is from Duivendak and Scholte, who have argued that in the Netherlands after the turn of the millennium, Dutch integration policy and research has become marked by what they call an assimilationist turn. So this includes the narrative of an alleged failure of multiculturalism, and also the notion that migrant groups do not only have to integrate in socio-economic areas, but also have to adapt and adjust to Dutch identity and culture. And we see this also in the reports because besides a focus on socio-economic integration, the role of so-called socio-cultural integration has started to gain more and more attention. And socio-cultural integration is then defined as the extent to which allochthonous groups are becoming part of the receiving society or keep distinguishing themselves. And mixed marriage is discussed as a part of that socio-cultural integration then. Now, another researcher who critically studied discourse on integration in the Netherlands is Willem Schinkel. So his argument is that the diagrammar of immigrant integration is a grammar of separation. So the underlying principle or the underlying idea of the concept of integration are organicist and functionalist notions of society as a body consisting of parts that make it up as a whole. And integration functions as a kind of coordinating concept to make sense of the parts and the whole. And through this notion of integration, he says we can make that certain diagnoses about society and identify the dysfunctional and problematic parts that require reintegration. So the contemporary perspective on mixed marriage and partner choice fits into this frame by understanding mixed marriage as a reflection of existing group boundaries, so as a reflection of society's different parts, but also by seeing it as a potential for the disappearance of those boundaries. So the parts disappearing and society becoming a unified whole. So we see this assimilationist turn or this assimilationist thought very clearly reflected in how we perceive mixed marriage, because it always indicates the dissolving kind of minority groups into the majority population. And this is a very one-dimensional representation of what mixed marriage is, what mixing is, and the way mixed couples navigate difference and prejudice in their everyday lives. And it also further politicizes the intimate lives and contributes to the racialization of people with a migration background in the Netherlands. So bringing all of this together, research on mixed marriage in the Netherlands is strongly influenced by notions of kinship, birthplace, group membership, but also the reproduction of culture and group boundaries through marriage patterns and intimacy. So we have been able to see that, first of all, it strongly builds upon and is dependent on these data practices that produce this allochtonization of migrants, as de Koning has called it. So really the sorting and ordering of people into ethnic groups based on birthplace and lineage. And this is then combined with the idea that kinship ties and marital partners are ways through which groups reproduce themselves. So based on the operationalization of sociocultural integration, as I described earlier, right, the becoming part of the majority or remaining distinct, the reports very often suggest that specifically Turkish and Moroccan populations remain distinct from the majority population because of higher levels of endogamy. And that's a trend that is considered problematic for integration, problematic for society. So yeah, as a final conclusion, I would say that these reports reproduce this assimilationist social imaginary in which migrant groups either remain as an alien body, remain as a problematic other in society, or as an integration ideal disappear or dissolve into the autochthonous majority. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to having to hearing your questions and comments and having a conversation also about this.
Thank you so much. What a fantastic presentation. And although I knew you were a PhD student, just when you said at the beginning, you know, you're only in your second year, that was seriously impressive. And thank you so much for joining us and sharing your, you know, your project and your thoughts so far. Yeah, and just, you know, again, just so fascinating thinking about whether other countries even take these statistics, whether we use these kind of terminologies, and certainly like, you know, the meanings that are attached to these terms, I think was really poignant in your presentation. So thank you so much for that. It doesn't look like there's any questions in the chat, so we'll move ahead to Briony's presentation now, if that's okay, Briony. If she's in, yes.
Okay, let me just unmute.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really pleased to have been invited. I feel like I ought to introduce myself as something of an interloper, perhaps, because I'm not an academic, and my presentation is a documentary work, perhaps even an art project, but it's very much grounded in a ethnographic foundation, really. So I'm just going to excuse myself because I've got quite a cold, and if I'm sneezing or coughing, I apologise. So I'm going to screen share and hopefully get you to the right place. Did screen share work there?
Not yet.
Did it? Hang on.
It was working earlier, so we know it can do it.
Screen share. There we go. Desktop 2.
Perfect. Yeah. Oh, we've got your desktop. Yes, that looks good.
Have we got a single slide there?
No, we've got maybe if you want to sort of start the presentation, or we've got your notes at the bottom as well.
Okay. No, sorry. I just need to click the other desktop. Keynote.
Perfect. There we go.
One more click.
Brilliant.
You got a single slide now?
We have. Yes. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay. So this is the name of the project I'm going to be sharing. Could you just give me a time shout, because now my Zoom icons are covering up my timer here. If you could give me a shout at 5 minutes, maybe, Charlotte.
Of course, yeah, we'll do.
Thanks. So, yeah, my project is about African plus British partnerships. So 2 people, one of whom comes from, or at least spent the formative period of their life in Britain, and the other one in an African country. The project's so far been in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. The families are there, I should say. So I'll give you a little backstory, because it's a project that started with me. I was 19 when I went on a teaching placement to Zanzibar, which is a very beautiful, idyllic island off the coast of Tanzania. And I was a clueless 19-year-old put in a teaching role, and very quickly recognised this sort of unearned status that was bestowed on white people, and how this was clearly evidence that our colonial inheritance was still pervasive there. And while I was there, I fell for a local guy who's, and that relationship was obviously had a huge influence on my experience, and my feelings for him became very much defined my experience of the place. It was a confusing relationship, to say the least. We had no shared model of how couple should operate. He spoke fluent English. I didn't speak much Swahili, but he's growing up in a very traditional Muslim community. So yeah, we tried to navigate this gap in an inelegant but constantly exciting way. And I think for us both at that age, it was quite thrilling. So I started to become quite fascinated in these foreign plus local partnerships, and recognize that the only sort of depictions I had seen of them before now were very stereotyped, you know, the powerful white man with the African lover as his plaything, or just the, you know, master servant role. And I became interested in seeing beyond that. Obviously I knew I was experiencing something beyond that. But I was also really aware of the potential of exploitation in these partnerships in both directions. In that, as a visitor, if you if you get into a relationship with a local, you're being given a key in a way to get closer to that community, to access things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to, a potential shortcut to assimilation perhaps. And if you're a local in this island which has very little educational or career opportunities, then the idea of a ticket to Europe is, you know, a big dream for many young people there, and a relationship might be your best way to do that. So I felt the weight of all that, and without time to tell you my own love story, that very dynamic sort of ended our relationship. But so I went on to build this into a project where I found other couples who were willing to share their lives with me. These are 5 of them. And so I began this in 2012. That's when I met all of these couples, and I've returned to them 4 to 5 times each since then, 3 to 5 times differing. Sometimes at first I would sort of spend a day with them and see if I could come back another day, and built up a relationship to where the second time I came, in many cases I was staying in their homes with them, or if not staying with them, I was sort of spending full days over the course of a week or 2 each time. In some cases literally sharing bedrooms with the whole families. So they were generally very open to this. So I'm going to just give you very sort of brief introductions to the families that I'm have been most involved with, without time to go into their full stories. I'll just try and give you the sort of most interesting elements of each in the context of this presentation. So this first couple are in Uganda, in a place called Jinja. This is Kat and Alex. And when I met them, they were perhaps quite typical of a partnership you might find here. This is like a backpacker hub. And there's lots of NGOs as well. So you could find a lot of young visitors hooking up with young locals for the sort of carefree holiday romance. And theirs looked a bit like that at first. Mainly, I would say I made that judgment because of their difference in their sort of limited communication. She spoke almost no Ugandan, his language, and he spoke quite basic English. And she's a real chatter as well, Kat, and she's university educated. He's got a very basic primary education, and he was a motorbike taxi driver called a boda driver in Uganda. So their communication was quite limited, but the relationship was based on playfulness and excitement and a lot of partying, and certainly the physical element. But they seemed very committed to making it work. And next time I saw them, Kat had baby Aaliyah, and they were living together. And by this point, I think the relationship became very much based on the tasks and joys of parenting. And Alex was a very committed dad, and he was working odd jobs, but mainly being the dad, while she worked at a special needs school. And that's Kat in Alex's home. That's the compound that most of his family live on and where he grew up. And they now live in the town in a pretty decent house. So moving on. This is Simon and Doreen. They're also in Uganda in a different area called Mbale. And they really flip the stereotype, I should say. She's a qualified lawyer. She just qualified when I met them, and he wasn't working at the time, having come over a few years before with his mum's church missionary group. And then he'd had a few odd jobs. He has Asperger's, which makes it hard for him to keep jobs, and harder so with the cultural differences. And so they were living with her parents, which for her parents who are, working, achieving middle class, probably Ugandans, to have their daughter qualify graduate university, and then get married and then return home with a husband, and even a Western husband who would be assumed to be wealthy, was quite almost a social embarrassment for them. So it was a very unusual situation. And he was being the, at that point she'd just had this baby while I was there. So they were all at home together, rubbing along sort of surprisingly well. And they're now living in Britain, and she's working, and he is the stay-home dad. And they're very sort of open about their power dynamics, and he will kind of cite the Bible as his justification that he's the head of the household, but she's not really having any of that, and it seems to me quite clear that she's the head of the household, and she's a bit of a feminist, and yet I think partly their religious background sort of ties them together in their outlook, and they're doing well.
Briony, about 5 minutes, if that's okay.
Okay, so I should speed up. There we go. I'll move on to Paul and Wahida. This is an example of the wealthy older white man with the beautiful young African wife. Paul is a very interesting, complicated character, as is Wahida, and I could make a feature film just on them. I wish I could tell you half of the amazing and some awful things that happened in their relationship, but in very brief, he converted to Islam when he came to Tanzania, and Wahida is his third wife, or had one British wife, then a Tanzanian wife, with whom he built this impressive house and had the kids, and but they had broken up, and Paul and Wahida got together shortly before I met them. They got married after 2 weeks of meeting, and both in a point in life where they were in need, is how they put it, and they gave each other what they needed. And he was in just one example of their dramas. This beautiful horse dropped dead one day, which Paul believes was due to the witchcraft spell that his ex-wife put on them as a sort of way to get rid of Wahida. So there was also a lot of external forces on them, her family not approving of Paul, etc. So here's Wahida, who had a very tough life, and an abusive husband who she had left before Paul. Yeah, so the dynamic in there is really complicated, and they've been in and out of their relationship, but they had a baby about 6 years ago. Last time I talked to them, they were together, but it's very tumultuous. This is Shazam Juma, who are really interesting couple. They're probably, I would say, the most sort of seemingly balanced relationship. This is where Juma grew up, and this is his dad. When I asked his dad how many kids he had, he laughed for a while and tried to consult other people to count them up and said he thought it was about 40. And Shaz and Juma are living a very sort of typical 2.4 family with two kids, and in a nice house they've bought in town. He's a whitewater rafting instructor, and she's works in education. Although when they met, he was a singer. They have interesting sort of further family dynamics in terms of their family's perspective on their relationship, which I probably don't have time to go into, but yeah, the sort of second generation of these families, what their parents and even grandparents perceive of their relationships has been really interesting, and starkly different, you know, within one generation. So I ought to move on. I'm going to just show you a few more couples without telling the stories because I don't have time. And then I will show you a 3-minute film, which is sort of a trailer for the project, which was cut to introduce the project, also potentially to get a commission, a film commission. This is my oldest couple who have been through it all, including Idi Amin's regime in Uganda. She was one of the very few white people who stayed. Okay, so I'm going to play you. I'm going to play you this trailer on the screen. If your connection's not very good, you can just go directly to the film yourself, which I'm going to paste in the chat, if indeed I can access the chat from here.
You should be able to, yeah, if you go to the bottom bar.
Yeah, I don't get anything coming up. I just have to close the presentation, I think, to get there, and then open up again. Oh, I don't think I can access it until I start.
That's okay. I think I can find
Do
a
you
link
have it
in the chat if you want to keep going with playing, and then if
okay, great. So if it doesn't play well through to your screen, have a look in the chat where Charlotte will put the link, and you can just watch it on the website. It's only 3 minutes, so then we can all come back. So I will play.
It's really easy. We just got on. There are a lot of common assumptions about relationships between a Westerner and an African. I was concerned that if I was to tell them over the phone I've fallen in love with a man from Africa, that they would instantly picture like this man in like traditional dress living in a mud hut.
If someone calls me black, I feel good. And if someone says the darkest man, I even feel better.
I only met him for 2 weeks, and he said, we are going to get married tomorrow. Maybe I can love him, or maybe not.
The word Muslim in Uganda is used for, should I use the word white people?
Africans generally think Muzungus are made of money. I refuse to let him treat me like the African woman to think I would He hates ethnicity.
I am going to teach her my language from the day she gets out. And this way, me and her can talk about the man in front of her and she won't understand.
Obviously, she's different to all the other kids in the village. They will always be a little bit fascinated by her in the way that they're always a little bit fascinated by me. I came here thinking I'm a bloody Westerner and I know everything about everything. With starry eyes. I'm going to save the world! And check as many people on my way as possible.
I always used to think that I would never marry a Ugandan man or I'd never be with them forever because I'd expect them to cheat. I think that these days I'm probably more like an African wife.
I don't know, I feel like I'm becoming Tanzanian. I'm becoming more comfortable being who I am here, yes. I don't really believe in marriage, but I know it's important to him. But we'll see, he hasn't actually asked me to marry him.
Okay, that's it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Briony. It's a really very kind of sweet note to end on. That was very funny. If you're okay to stop sharing, thank you. Then Alison can put the other slide back up. That would be great. Thank you so much. I mean, what a fascinating project. And actually, I know you said, oh, I feel like a bit of an interloper, but it's a very sort of deeply anthropological project, you know, from my point of view, at least. That's what my PhD was in, and it really felt very, you know, so many anthropological projects are very personal, and that's on you know, often why we have a kind of interest in these subjects. I mean, one thing that really struck me, and I was so glad to see that you'd included couples who kind of disrupted some of these norms, I think, around, like, you know, the white man with the young sort of beautiful African wife, let's say, to think about ways in which other kinds of stratification, if you like, kind of play into these kind of relationships and the dynamics within the relationships. And that, I thought, was actually something I'd like to ask Sherilyn about a little bit more as well. And to a certain extent, Natalia, you know, thinking about how issues like gender, certainly, obviously race and ethnicity, but also kind of generational status and wealth, like, you know, how all of these factors then shape these sort of relationship dynamics, just seemed to be something that kind of came out in all of the presentations. And so, Sherilyn, I didn't know if there was, you know, obviously there's this kind of category of people who marry somebody or who are, you know, have parents, one of whom is you know, not born in the Netherlands, but whether then that was kind of segregated further by, you know, whether it's the mother or the father, or whether they're of a certain kind of class. And you talked obviously about kind of this label being applied to kind of migrant groups in particular, but whether it was also used to refer to other kinds of mixed couples in your work. But also, Brian, if you had, and Natalia, if you had any thoughts on that, that would be very interesting as well, relating to your projects. And then, as Alison has very helpfully said, if panelists want, if attendees want to kind of get their thoughts together and post any questions in the chat, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that, actually. I think it's a very interesting question, and it immediately brings up, so right now I presented the part of my research that, of course, focuses on these reports, and in the reports the categorization is quite formal, so there's not a real distinction on whether it's the father or the mother that was born abroad. It's just having one parent being born abroad. But as you see here, we see that mixed marriages sort of mobilized to talk about integration or assimilation. But in another part of my research, where I look more at sort of public discourses and narratives around mixed marriages, we see that it can also be mobilized for other things. For instance, to talk about women's emancipation, and especially the emancipation of Muslim women. So there's a big, I feel sorry I can show it to you right now, but there was a campaign that actually caused quite some controversy in the Netherlands, and a lot of discussion in the media as well, where we could see mixed couples being intimate in the city of Rotterdam, and sort of the slogan of the campaign was, in the Netherlands you choose your own partner. So kind of the assumption was that if partner choice is completely free, so there's sort of no influence from any external factor that will result in, you know, everybody mixing and being sort of like this happy multicultural nation. But the posters, there were 4 posters, it was very clearly that it was focused specifically on Muslim women. So it was, and also in the initiators of the campaign also sort of said, you know, talked about this in you know, when it was discussed in media and etc. Like the importance of free partner choice specifically for Muslim girls. So it's very interesting how then mixing is mobilized in different ways, and how now I can, like, now gender wasn't really part of my presentation, but I can see it like coming back in other parts of my research as well, for sure. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, yeah, look forward to kind of seeing more on that side of things. Natalia, I don't know if you wanted to respond on any of that, or?
Yeah, sure. Like in terms of the research, the powerful positioning that does get played out intergenerationally is that with the mamitas being that central source of support, they are also quite the controllers, and they exert power on the future direction of the child, what's going to happen with particularly, you know, a year later when the babies were already coming to 1 year. And then the question of the mothers having to go back to school or to work became, you know, quite important. And so because there is the violence and there is distrust actually in the community as well, then the mamitas do exert that power in terms of what to do about childcare. And when they are aligned, then it's smooth and nice, but when they're not, then that does bring out the tensions that are common in family dynamics.
It's so interesting. I think certainly for quite a lot of us who've been looking at these issues, you know, in light of the pandemic and the way in which, you know, a lot of the measures around social distancing then forced people to kind of be very, you know, clear about who was in the bubble and who was out. And, you know, certainly in the case of the UK, formal childcare sort of not being an option, and therefore, you know, can you still ask your grandmother, or can you still call on a neighbour, and what, you know, what was allowed and what was not, I think, like you say, has really kind of crystallized some of these tensions, shall we say, you know, for some families. And yeah, it'd be quite interesting to see how that kind of pans out with your work as well. And Briony, I don't know if you wanted to say anything.
Yeah, I would say within the families, obviously my study, if it's a study, is very much qualitative, so I don't have broad generalizations to make, but within these families, the gender roles are really interesting. And one thing I learned was that often the Africans would, well, both parties would have different expectations. But if I speak specifically about the African men in the partnerships, for example, Alex told me that, you know, if he was married to a Ugandan woman, he wouldn't expect her to go out at night to go to bars and clubs. And yet, because Kat was British and he knew that was part of her culture, he accepted that. So she was carrying on a life like many 20-somethings British women would, and as well as being a mother. And yet, if she was to behave like that as a traditional Ugandan young mum, that would be disapproved of by, you know, certainly the generation above. And there was quite a few examples like that. Or, you know, people like, I thought in some cases that some of the British men were sort of having their cake and eating it, in terms of taking the parts of traditional African culture that said that they were allowed to be dominant, but it's at the same time, you know, still having their freedom as British men. And then in terms of the generational differences, they were enormous and really interesting. And I think a lot of the families were quite reluctant, even though, you know, there is this sort of privileging of white people and an unearned status that's given to them. So, you know, most people consider it's good if you have connections with Westerners or work with them or friendships, but bringing them into your family is a lot more complicated. And I think while a lot of young Africans I've met would like a Western partner, their parents see it as just bringing a lot of potential problems. And yet once they were in and they're accepted, I think the grandparent generation would often then sort of lower their expectations, not lower them to, you know, in a negative sense, but just put less expectations on them, because they couldn't sort of apply the same, you know, the same expectations just because there's too much cultural difference. So actually then I think there was a gap. Like I would say none of them are particularly close to the grandparents, these families.
That's really fascinating. Again, you know, thinking about things like kind of childcare and ideas around kind of cultural continuity, and, you know, again, I'm sort of talking as someone who has a mixed marriage, this idea of kind of grandparents being this conduit of a certain kind of cultural tradition, and how to kind of, you know, act as a gatekeeper to that with the child. And, you know, it really raises some really, you know, very interesting questions, I guess, around power, as you've all been mentioning, and where that sits within these family dynamics. So thank you very much, all of you, for that. We've got a question from Musharat in the chat. Musharat, I've allowed you to talk if you would like to talk, but I will start by reading out your question, if that's okay, and then if you want to add anything, feel free. The resurfacing of the Black Lives Matter movement has resulted in quite an uncomfortable conversation in my mixed heritage marriage. Things I'd not thought about, such as the intersectionality of privilege, ethnicity and gender, still oppressing and denying equal space for me and others. I am Muslim, I'm from the global south. In light of this, what are the views of the panel in how their work is leading to the process of female emancipation and the decolonizing of research? So again, Musharat, if you want to add anything to that, then feel free. But otherwise, is there anyone from the panel who'd like to respond to that?
I can go ahead. Yeah, I would say that it's certainly still very true. You know, that yeah, that equal space is denied in many cases. I sort of have perhaps a naive optimism that within mixed marriages, that is the place in which it's being, people are pushing for that emancipation and that equality. Of course, that's not always the case, and in some partnerships it will be the opposite, and that somebody, you know, may be taking advantage of that position. But there are plenty of examples where partnerships are pushing past those, you know, colonial attitudes. And in terms of my work, I just hope that in showing real examples, showing these honest stories, I can contribute to a conversation that, yes, there is still oppression along lines of privilege and ethnicity, and let's not pretend there isn't, but people are working through it in their individual families as best they can in some cases, but where it is still there, we can also look at it. Yeah, that's what I'm hoping to do and say.
Thank you. Sherilyn or Natalia, any comments on that? Natalia?
I'm happy to. It's a great question. Thank you very much. I think about that in sort of 3 dimensions, from the personal, the research, the conceptual, and then from the praxis. So I think from the personal, we kind of think about how the North is inside the South. And so think about my own privileges, but also the internalized oppression that I was socialized into growing up in Colombia, and which pretty much permeates not just practices, but like the representations of patriarchy that are still very common and maintained through machismo and through traditional gender roles. So I'm talking about what you were saying, Charlotte, in terms of breaking that intergenerational transmission. I endeavor to do that with not passing some of that on and breaking that cycle. So that's the personal. From the research and the conceptual is, again, to acknowledge the racism, the classism, the sexism, all of these intersecting inequalities that occur not just in the North, but in the South as well. So it's about not homogenizing groups and communities, and again, to like stop this essentializing that we always do and assume that because we come from the South, then we adhere to a certain background. But in fact, there's lots of shades into that are constantly played out. And I know that they are very much there in Colombia and in Latin America. So just to continue questioning and challenging these inequalities through my work and through engaging in dialogues such as this one. And then in terms of the praxis, just one example, when I'm in the community, I serve as a bridge to connect, for instance, community peer mothers with policymakers or with the stakeholders that run the health institution, which they otherwise would not have the access. So by me being there and using that position of power, I enable some dialogues that can be fruitful at times. And then push a little bit, or be part of the pushing in terms of changing a little bit of policy. I mean, one important victory that I'm not going to take credit for at all, but was part of that whole wave, was that in the local hospital, they did not provide any pain relief for childbirth. And when I first encountered that, I was quite shocked. And upon conversations and lots of engagements, and again, a lot of other doctors and practitioners engaging in that, now they do have pain relief offered. So those are my 3 points.
Wow, that is an incredibly valuable contribution just in and of itself. I mean, that really is quite shocking. Well, thank you for that those examples. Sherilyn, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think it's a very relevant question. I think in my case, because my research is situated in the Netherlands, and I'm also from the Netherlands myself, I would say that I mean, I don't know what the comparison would be with the UK, but there's a lot of work to be done in the Dutch context. There's not much space to talk about racism, topics like this within academia. So I think that's something that I'm trying, me and a lot of other colleagues are trying to push against. And I think like part of what I'm doing is really trying to sort of critically unpack what is happening, and I think that's sort of the first step that needs to be taken. So that's why I don't just want to look at public discourses around mixed marriage, but I also want to look at knowledge production, because I think these sort of areas are not disconnected from each other. I mean, we take so much from the sciences, from the social sciences, and it influences how we talk, we think about issues like this. So yeah, that's just very briefly what I wanted to add. Thank you again for the question.
Thank you. And I think that then sort of speaks back to what Natalia was talking about in her presentation, and the way these concepts themselves are, political and how they get mobilized. Yeah, so it's really important work. Thank you. I've got a quick, yeah.
I do have a follow-on question, Charlotte. So
yeah.
Yeah, it was just to Sherilyn. I understood from your presentation that at least what you were focusing on today, and sorry if I misunderstood, was like policy and policy documents and some reports which were related to policy organizations. But you just referred there to more academic literature. So I wondered if you could speak a bit more about that, and whether there was particular disciplinary associations, or whether you were able to see kind of differences coming out in the ways this discourse around integration and assimilation was coming out. Thanks a million.
Yes, so the material that I showed is actually, it is from research reports, so it's not necessarily policy documents. It is policy-oriented research though, so it's often research that is funded by the government in order to answer certain policy-related questions about integration. So sorry, can you just repeat the second part of your question for me?
Yeah, I wondered if you sort of looked at kind of wider academic literature, so not necessarily those that were in responding to funding calls from the government, for example,
Yeah.
and we're trying to address policy questions, but more disciplinary research, and whether you could see disciplinary patterns or whether that was something you were going to look into in the future.
Yes, so definitely. Yeah, I'm also looking at sort of how these reports, like where the sort of theoretical foundations of, you know, of thinking about mixed marriage in the ways I described, where they come from. And yes, there's a clear link also with, you know, researchers and scholars working in more academic fields and less so in you know, policy, or do less so policy-oriented research. And what I'm also trying to do, because I think when we talk about decolonizing, I think it's also very important to take that into account, is to also look at sort of the historical embeddedness of this research. So for instance, in the Netherlands, like what I explained now in terms of thinking about mixed marriage through these categorizations of allochthone, autochthone, and migration background, that's something quite recent actually. Up until, I think, in the Netherlands itself, up until the late 1970s, it was mixed marriage was considered to be between Christian denominations. So I'm also trying to see, like, what about you know, what about the ways scholars and researchers were thinking about mixed marriage back then sort of still resonates today, and what has changed, and why is that the case? And then I haven't even touched upon sort of how mixed marriage was talked about, and how it was written about in the Dutch colonies, for instance. So I'm trying, so part of my research, but it's still something that I have to dive into in more depth, is also to make sense of those historical continuities and discontinuities. And I think that's very important when we want to do, you know, research that's decolonizing.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting problem that I felt the same in my project. Like, where do you start and stop? And the historical context is so important, and yet it's such an enormous subject that you have to draw the line somewhere. And of course, the difference is between, in your case, Dutch colonies, in my case, British colonies, in the difference between what happened there in the past, what happens there now, what happens now in Britain or Holland, as the inheritance of that colonization. They're all very distinct and different in terms of the context for those relationships. And can you possibly look at them all? Well, maybe in a PhD you can, and good luck with it.
Thank you. Natalia, did you want to add anything on that? No? Great. Well, there don't seem to be any more questions in the chat. So unless the panelists would like to kind of raise anything for each other, like any comments you had about the papers, feel free to jump in. Oh, here we are. There's some comments here. Oh, Mary is asking, where can I watch the Love in Translation film in full? Briony, could you just talk about that?
I wish you could, but there isn't one. that is my teaser. I'm trying to get a commission. I have actually made one 10-minute film about one of the couples, which is Kat and Alex, but I haven't released it for various reasons. But if you follow me on social media, if you just Google my name, you'll find all my social medias. And while I've got the mic and a chance for making connections, I applied to be in this webinar because I'm really interested in collaborations with researchers and academics. I've done so in a lot of different contexts. I would love to do so with this project. So if anyone is interested, is working on the same subject, give me a shout. Or indeed, if you are interested in having photography or video of the subject that you're working on related to Decolonising Families and Relationships, please give me a shout.
Definitely. I mean, I'm sure there'll be lots of people here who would love to do that. Actually, a project that Catherine and I are working on at the moment, trying to think about not just kind of ways of disseminating findings, but actually building in kind of more like visual methods into the research design, and you know, encouraging the families that we're working with to be sort of part of that process in providing like images or videos. And but obviously that would still need somebody who had you know,
yeah, that's another thing I've often done, is the kind of user-generated content is a really interesting way to work in. Almost sometimes you get more intimacy, if less technical proficiency, of course, but anyway, that's another conversation.
Brilliant. Well, thank you everybody so much for sharing your you know, your thoughts and your findings today, and obviously to Briony for sharing the project. I really hope it does get commissioned, because I'd love to see more of it. As I said, this has been recorded, so this will be available to BSA members on the Families and Relationships website, as is the first recording from our session in November. The next one is coming up on the 18th of June, so we'll be circulating details about that probably after the Easter break, I expect. But thank you again to everyone for being here. Really enjoyed it. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for listening, and thanks for inviting me. It was really interesting.
No, absolutely.
Presentations too. Thank you.
Thank you. Catherine and Alison, do you want to stay online just for a moment? And if Catherine, you're happy to pause